Welcome to the LDD podcast, where we dive deep into the minds of remarkable leaders serving in different ministry platforms. Each episode brings you inspiring conversation, thought-provoking stories, and practical ministry insights from the people making a difference. Whether they are pastors, ministry leaders, or everyday servants, this podcast gives you a front row seat to their journey, challenges, and lessons learned along the way. Today's episode, Global Mission and Discipleship, will feature Dr. Payne. She holds a Master of Divinity from the Pentecostal Theological Seminary and a Doctor of Ministry degree from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Kathy is currently serving in her 12th year, coordinating the global missions ministries for the Church of God of Prophecy internationally. These ministries encompass mission work and have taken her to more than 120 world nations. So grab your headphones, get comfortable, and enjoy this conversation.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of our Leadership Development and Discipleship podcast. I'm Alejandra, and I'm your host for today, and I'm thrilled to continue our series, Rediscovering Discipleship. In today's episode, we will dive into the topic of discipleship, but today from a global perspective. Our conversation will be centered in Jesus' words in Matthew 28:19-20. He says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations." We will focus on that phrase, of all nations, and baptize them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I will be with you always, to the very end of the ages. In this episode, we'll explore how cultural awareness and sensitivity can enrich our disciple-making efforts, helping us to share the gospel with wisdom and with love. We'll also inspire you with practical ways to engage in both local and international opportunities to spread the good news. And for that, we have Dr. Payne with us. Hi, Kathy.
Hi.
It's good to have you here with us today. And I would like to start with a question about yourself. I want to know about your experience working with global missions as a director for the Church of God of Prophecy. And also, how have you seen your involvement of discipleship within global missions and the areas that you have ministered to?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for having me on today. It's always a joy to talk about some of the things that the Lord is doing and how He is leading and how He opens doors for us and opportunities for us. I have been here at the international offices for about 30 years. About half of those have been directly involved in global missions. My first few years here was working with women's ministries as the international director. And that responsibility took me to many nations where I had the opportunity to see and experience things that perhaps were in preparation for when I would come to work in global missions ministries. I've had just the delight of being in the homes and among the family members of our international family, seeing different kinds of worship, seeing different kinds of leadership stylings, seeing and experiencing different cultural situations, different kinds of foods, different languages, different worship, and that has been such a blessing in my life to see the expansion of what God is doing, of who He is, how He moves among His people, all of those things. It feels like and seems like that it has been an opening experience for me.
Yes. From my perspective, what I've been able to see working in the international offices is that you, like, everybody knows you, but you also know everybody. That is a general idea, right? But I do see, and I do think that you know people personally pretty well. And as we are rediscovering the idea of discipleship as a relational dynamic, I think that's a very important thing to think about. So I would like for you to elaborate what that relationality has looked like from your role.
I think it's a good question, and I think it reminds me of how I first came here. I came into a position that had been established for a very long time by someone else, and the ministry that I came to was pretty much known by her, and she was a dynamic, incredible leader. And so to come in to a role that she had served with such longevity, I realized that there were expectations that came with that. And I guess I had been here maybe for about 6 months, and our international bishop called me down to his office, and he began to speak with me about how he wanted to know how I was doing. He wanted to know, was there anything that he could do to help my my learning curve, and um, all of the things that come with moving from a predominant lifestyle of one nation and one language pretty much. I came to understand Spanish a little bit more, but he wanted to know how I was doing. I said, I feel like I'm doing okay personally. And so he began to talk about this aspect of not just people knowing me, but um, how much they loved me. And that was surprising to him. He said, this church loves you. And I said, yes. And he said, I mean, you replaced an icon in this church, and he said, it's amazing to see how easy you went through that, and how much everybody loves you. And I said, well, don't talk about how much people love me as like it's unbelievable. There's a reason that people love me, and there's a reason that I have become known. And I think that is, in fact, it's hard not to love someone that really loves you. It's hard not to want to know someone who seems to know you. And I said, actually, Brother Murray, people have gifts in their lives, and this is a gift that the Lord has given me. I don't think that I don't even calculate how to love. It's genuine. When I meet someone, I feel like I've known them all my life, and I feel like they have now become a part of who I am. And I said, I know that that's unnatural for other people, but the fact that it is so natural for me lets me know that it is a gift that God has given to me. And I don't ever want to take that for granted, that immediately you become part of someone's life. That's not always so easy for for most of us perhaps. But I think for me that is one of the gifts the Lord gave me. I'll never sing the house down. I'll probably never preach those deep messages that people will live with forever. But the fact that His love generates through me so easily, and that that becomes an immediate connection, and that is part of discipleship. It is part of the fact that Jesus loved these people that He came into contact with immediately. It was like He knew them. It was like He knew everything about them, and of course we know that He did. um, that established a connection that would then lead to discipleship, mentoring, all of those elements that become part of the Great Commission.
Yeah. I think what I'm hearing from you too is um, you have let yourself be loved by the people, which is a crucial component of them responding to that love. Like if you were to close yourself in these relationships and just approach them from a dynamic of I'm a director, or I'm in this particular position, and I'm going to show you um I'm going to have this type of communion, not communion, but like type of communication with you from this director's perspective, would look very different than the relationships that you have formed because you have not only loved them, but you have allowed them to love you. Is that
Fortunately,
correct?
positions have never been really important to me.
Yeah.
It's what's more important is relationships.
hmm Going off of this relational dynamic, we see the words of Jesus in Matthew 28:19 to 20, and then we see
Right.
Acts 1 8, and they teach us about the call of global disciple making. How do you approach this text, Kathy?
I love this text.
hmm
I love it, first of all, because it's personal.
hmm
I love the fact that Jesus invites us personally into this huge, eternal um, understanding that it's not just for people with titles. It's not just for people with doctorates. It's not just for people who are smart or wealthy, or there are no conditions on it. It's personal, and it's for everyone. Everyone is invited to become part of this. Um, I think that part of it is so revealing of who Jesus is and who he came to be for all of us. Uh, as the very Son of God, then he came to make us all co-sons. I mean, co-laborers, co-everything. We get to be part of that. And then, of course, this word that is go in the present indicative tense, which is this urgent command. You know, it's not just, hey, let's go to the store, let's go eat a meal and fellowship together. No, it's this huge command, urgent, go ye, you, personal. That part of it is what draws us in to begin with. And then the fact that he delineates, he's very specific in what we're to do. We're to go, we're to teach, and he's specific who we're to teach. Everybody. This is for everyone. This is not exclusive. It's for everyone. And of course, the joy of that is it's very purposeful. It's the ends of the earth for the end of the world. Ends of the earth for the end of time. End of the world for the end of all sin and conflict. Um it's marvelous in that it is for each of us, and that we can each find our directive in it. As we look at the disciples to whom he was speaking, each one of them were so different. I mean, you had lawyers, you had um, people who had been thieves and fishermen, and there were the upper echelon like Paul, who trained at the feet of Gamaliel, who was invited into this um, wonderful and precious, urgent command to go and to reach and to bring into fellowship and into discipleship.
It always amazes me that Jesus' ministry took place in a very, very just localized in a very small area,
Limited.
limited area, and how impactful it was. And also the vision of to the ends of the earth, of all nations, um, always amazes me because it took their obedience to get them there and to get us here where we are today. Um, so it starts in a very localized type of form, and it expanded to the nations. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's interesting that he modeled that. It
Mm-hmm.
did start in a very, very limited resource of God's people, Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And almost immediately, he takes them outside of the acceptable parameters. We're
Mm-hmm.
going to the Gentiles. He moves them out of, when it comes time to make a trip near Samaria, they're ready to take the road around. He said, "Oh no, we're going right through Samaria." And
Mm-hmm.
so he modeled all of their exceptions,
Yeah.
all of their limitations. He, in fact, I learned probably in seminary, perhaps more than any other place, how much of his ministry that was, I mean, he came for Israel, he came for his people, and yet how much of his ministry was outside of the regional area of his people, and how he immediately moved beyond the acceptabilities of religious um, um, constrictions.
Yeah. I like that because it is not, even though it was limited in the area, uh, when it comes to a territory, it was not limited to a type of people or a kind of people. It was not exclusive. And I really like that you mentioned that because sometimes we feel that we are limited by the area that we're in, but there are so many people within our area, so much fertile ground around us, and the opportunity to do this from also an intercultural perspective where we are.
You mentioned that I had it's been a few years that I ago since I had the opportunity to go to Pakistan, and it was a real eye-opening situation for me because I knew going in, proselytizing through the gospel to the majority of that population is against the law. In fact, we still have pastors that are in prison based upon their efforts to share the gospel beyond the acceptable, the legal limits within that nation. And yet I came into that nation. Uh, I had been invited to do a crusade. And I really thought that I would be invited to do a women's conference among our people before I would be involved in this outreach crusade. And so they took me into um, the first few hours that I was there, they immediately provided clothing that would make me look Pakistani. Somebody came, it's terribly insulting for someone to come. You've been off the plane for about an hour, you've been traveling into this place, and a man comes and starts taking your measurements. He's putting his, and you're like, no, 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 I don't want you to see how big I am. You're looking at all of these very small bodies in Pakistan, and he's measuring you so that you can look as un-American if you can, if you please. And of course, there was no way they were making me look un-American, even with their clothes on. It was still clear that American was walking through. But they took me to this field that was fenced in, walled in, actually with stone. And they had told me how careful I'd have to be, and they had this group of young military-like young men walking around me with like rapid fire guns in camouflage, and we're walking down the middle of the street, and I'm thinking, it seems to me like you're bringing a whole lot of attention to me instead of really letting me go incognito. But when I got there, even before I got there, I could hear the worship coming, so I could tell that this was going to be heard a great distance. And in the middle of this message about Jesus, that particular night I was speaking on Bartimaeus. And as I was screaming out the way that I would imagine Bartimaeus screaming out, and his recognition that this wasn't just a prophet, this was the Son of David. It was very specific in the way Bartimaeus called Jesus and recognized him, not just as a prophet, not just as a healer, not just as an evangelist. He recognized who he was and that he said it. And in the middle of my message, as I'm preaching the gospel of Jesus in this walled um, piece of land, just an empty lot, really, is what it was, with on the top of the wall all the way around, military every 10 or 12 feet with their gun in the air, ready to. I don't know if they were there to protect me or protect Pakistan from me. I'm not really sure which it was, but as I'm sharing in this moment, I'm calling out as Bartimaeus would have called out, and the recognition of the way in which he called him. He recognized that he was the Son of God. And as I'm saying that, the realization comes to me that this word on Jesus is being proclaimed to more than the 2,500 people that are in this, packed into this empty lot. It's going for, I don't even know how far. My voice preaching the gospel, which is absolutely against the law. And here I am sharing it beyond the limits, and how God is at work orchestrating every piece of that.
Yeah.
I could never have orchestrated it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet here he is in the center of an empty lot in Pakistan where 25, and so that night when I got back to the bishop's house, I asked him, how many of those people, it seemed like a larger crowd than I would have believed would have been our people. I said, how many of those people there tonight were Christians, were our people? And he said, about 300. And of course, the crowd was estimated 2,500. I didn't estimate them. I'm not so good at estimating. But I was told, and even outside of where people were sitting on the ground, people were standing
Yeah.
everywhere and outside the walls and within proximity. And I said, who are the other people? I mean, how did you get over 2,000 people here that aren't Christians? They're in search of a God who's alive, who's real, who is very much part of. And so that then begins the part of discipleship, because then these people who find Jesus, who are delivered, who are healed, miraculously healed that night. We saw cancers falling off people that night. This was like a 3-night, 4-night event. And I thought, for something that I understood to be very constricted, very small, very much among our people, God orchestrated it all to begin a process that Jesus said 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Go
Mm-hmm.
and tell and preach and teach and sustain so that they are part of the promise.
Yeah. And that he says that he would be with us to the end of the ages.
To
And
the end of the
I
ages.
think your story like really highlights that point, because it was not uh, with your own might or your own eloquence, but it was God with you, Jesus with
Yeah,
you, accompanying you in that mission.
absolutely.
Um, how can you, so this story makes me think of cultural awareness and
Oh, yeah.
sensitivity
Yeah.
because, you're encountering a new environment, you're wearing new clothes, that if you did not have a sensitivity to what is happening, you might even feel offended, um, by wearing, other type of clothes, or even,
Or be
trying to merge with
offensive
the people
by
or
not
be
wearing them.
offensive to them. Yeah. So how can cultural awareness and sensitivity impact the effectiveness or of our disciple making efforts in a global manner?
I think for me, culturally, everything is a learning experience.
Hmm.
Everything. When I was really young, I was 19 when I got married. John and I began ministering pretty quickly after we first got married. Actually, we were ministering together before we were
Hmm.
married. But as we traveled, our first big journey of ministry was across the United States. And as we began to minister across the United States, everywhere we went provided new surroundings, new ways of doing things. I began to learn what Paul meant when he said we have to become all things to all people. And so with Paul as a mentor, I learned how to be calm and to be aware of what it meant to be all things to all people. To understand that if I couldn't if I couldn't cross that bridge, it was offensive. And if they couldn't get past how I looked, how I presented myself, how I communicated, they'd never hear what I was going to say. And so many places where I went in those early days, they would say things like, "Can you not wear that? Can you not cut your hair? Can you be careful on your makeup? Can you be careful that you don't dress yourself in such a way that you're so far above the people you're getting ready to minister that they won't even be able to hear what you have to say?" And so those things became really important. If they can't, if they can't get past what I present when they first see me, they're never going to hear what I say. And so that became very, very important. And I learned to not be offended when a bishop for some of our Latin American countries would say to me, "Please don't cut your hair before you come. Please, they will love the fact that you have long hair." And of course, I'm sorry, I get to crying and then I have to start being human. So part of that is that you understand what you have come to communicate is more important than who you are. And that you are not here representing Kathy Payne. You are here representing Jesus Christ. And so those were the kind of lessons I needed to learn pretty quickly. And I was able to learn them at a really early age so that as I got older, maybe it would have been a little harder for me to have focused in on it if I had gone as an older person in a huge defining role, rather than as this kid that was learning and growing in ministry and in discipleship and understanding that it's important to communicate something that is going to be a part of training this person in how they follow Christ.
Yeah.
I do know, you
Mhm.
haven't really asked me this question, but I'm going to hop to it. I do know that in our early years as a fellowship, when we began to become more international, we would
Mm.
open a nation. So part of what we were doing I'll just use, for example, in Africa, as we began to develop those nations, our ministry from England and Canada became very important. And most of that ministry were Jamaican. They had come from Jamaica. They had migrated to England. They had migrated to Canada. And these are the ministers that moved into our areas of Africa. Just like that happened in Africa, we had some of our leaders in Southeast, the United States Southeast, that went into Latin America. And unfortunately, what happened in some of those areas, and I don't want to be accusatory because I think it's completely normal and human for this to happen. They taught with the gospel some of their own cultures. If you can understand what I'm saying, and I think you can because we're all human.
Yeah. Hmm.
They taught their own cultures alongside of. So part of that, perhaps that came from America to Latin America, were especially difficult for women to then be raised up and thrive. So when I went to Latin America, 30 years later. I encounter women who um, are not allowed to cut their hair. There are hygiene things that they're not allowed to do
Mm-hmm.
because this cultural aspect became very much a part of um, the lifestyle of Christianity within our fellowship. And so I had several bishops that would come to me even before I came that would say, um, Sister Kathy, while you're with us, will you teach, especially in ladies' retreats, which is what I was doing when I first came into the role, can you teach our women that it's okay for them to highlight their assets, that it's okay for them to fix their hair, it's okay for them to feel good about the way they look, to counter some of the cultural teaching that came into effect years ago. Can you perhaps help our women advance? It wasn't everywhere I went, but and it was always interesting to me that it was some of perhaps the more conservative bishops that were asking me to do this, which was kind of against what I had learned myself. You go in, you become part of them, and that way, that's the way in which they'll learn from you. But
Mm-hmm.
they were trying to um, raise the level of discipleship to women and to be more inclusive. And it was a personal blessing to me, and at the same time, it was a little bit of a challenge in that I needed to know how far I could go without instilling my cultural expectations on them.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. And at the time, of course, for women, it was this thing of dress, that you had to have things right up here, and the length of your dresses had to be far enough in the middle, lower part of your leg, and they had to have sleeves. And even in the summer when it was brutally hot, there were these cultural restrictions on women that perhaps men got away with that were not so enforced on them, but on our women, which then led to um, further hygiene issues, if I could just make that correlation. And so it was an understanding that it's more than just this, I'm going to drop a load of word here and then I'm going to go away. You know, for discipleship to really move forward, it had to be more than that.
Yeah. I think what I'm hearing is, the complexity of this dynamic of culture, because we are not only trying to become sensitive to the culture of other or people of other nations, but also we have to become sensitive and understand our own culture. Like what parts of the way that we communicate our messages are also culturally our own, um, and not necessarily part of the greater explanation of the gospel. Like to me comes to mind just like how if you study the history of Christianity and of our movements, you're able to see just how intertwined culture is.
Mm.
And I'm thinking visually, I wish I could put a map on the screen, but you can trace how we've gone from place to place. But part of that has been carrying a little bit of those cultural dynamics from the places that we're coming from.
Right,
And then we go and deposit them somewhere else. And so
right,
then it is not only the message of the gospel that gets communicated, but also that cultural dynamic. And so what I'm seeing is like you were talking about how you learn from a young age to be able to adapt to these different dynamics and be able to say, I'm presenting Jesus instead of Kathy. I'm presenting the gospel instead of myself. So I'm going to be flexible and be able to understand where I'm going and be flexible with that. But at the
Right.
same time, there was the other point that adds to the complexity, which was, can
Help us
you
out
know,
here.
yeah,
Be
can
an
you,
example. Yeah.
yeah, can you please like tell, communicate to the women here that it's okay. So it's like you had to go in there. Um, I would experiencing not only experiencing it, but um, you had to go in there with that flexibility, but at the same time, they were like, "Can you please help us correct this?" So it is a very, very complex dynamic.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Um, so I think that covers some of like the challenges that missionaries face when engaging in different cultures. And as someone who has both, I'm not from the place where I currently live at, and I've had to experience that intercultural dynamic coming from a different country into the US, working here, adapting to culture here. But then
Yeah.
also, I spent some time in Eastern Europe during my years in college. And it was, that dynamic of adaptation and change. And for me, one of the challenges as a missionary was acknowledging those points of my culture that could get in the way of
Right.
communicating the gospel. But
Right.
also, not only that, but also the cultural shock of being in a different place where people don't speak my language, or although surprisingly, or in a surprising manner, in Serbia, a lot of people speak Spanish because of the novelas that they will get there.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
the media that they were able to watch and engage with. So that was a pleasant surprise, and it was a vehicle that got used for the gospel
Absolutely.
and be able to
Absolutely.
communicate with the people there. So it was a
Absolutely.
very amazing dynamic. But
I was I was grateful when you mentioned that. I was grateful that I've been more than one place where people don't wear clothes.
yeah,
I mean, they're naked. And they're naked. I mean, they don't wear clothes. And and it's uncomfortable. Because it is so very culturally different than,
yeah,
and you at the same time they're there to receive what you
hmm
have brought to impart,
yeah,
and so yes, I understand completely what you're saying. I
hmm
it's glorious, isn't it?
yeah. Goes from dressing to foods to the
Bathroom
history.
uses and
Yes.
everything, yeah.
hmm I also noticed that the dynamic of being sensitive to their history,
Exactly.
the way that we speak about things,
And
the
they're
words that we
leaders.
use, and their
Yeah,
leaders. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Um, why is this cultural awareness? I mean, we've been speaking about this, but why so essential to disciple making? If you could summarize some of the things that we have been talking about.
To disciple making. Well, I
hmm
think that perhaps in the foundation of building the church and leadership,
hmm
you've got to have a continuity, um, a trust, an authenticity, an integrity, and you're investing in it. So all of those are very much and it's one of the reasons that Jesus came, you know, um, to invest. He said he brought them. Come, follow me was the issue. Come, go with me. That was his first invitation. Come, follow me and walk with me and sit where I sit and eat what I eat and go where I go and go into the homes where I go, where you might not have wanted to go into those kind of homes because they're not accepted, or we're going to a tax collector's house today, or we're going to speak to a Samaritan woman, which is more dynamic. And so the enlargement of our understanding of the fullness of the gospel. I mean, really, Jesus had to make that known, and we see him. We model our discipleship, our disciple making, in the way that Jesus did. And part of it was he took on flesh. He came to us as we are. And then he enlarged our understandings of who's included uh, in that process of building leadership, building continuity, the intensity, the investment, the process of the dynamic of all the world, all the peoples. And I love the scene in Revelations um, where we see every nation, every people. You know, we see the end, that it was successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Perhaps that has a lot to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are some practical steps? And here in the question is, what are some practical steps that missionaries can take and disciple makers to build meaningful relationships in those cross-cultural contexts? And I think for me, missions and the word missionary, again, because of my particular experience, I always like expanded that definition to kind of like a traditional understanding of um, cross-cultural missions in that sense, or not cross-cultural missions. Um, I like to expand that to our understanding of going abroad, perhaps, and then coming back, but as participants in the mission of God, and that including the work of responding to the mission in our immediate context, but also going abroad. Um, what are some practical steps to build those meaningful relationships?
I think for me, Alejandra, what I have learned and what I am finding to be true is you have to be authentic. You have to be authentic to your calling. You have to be authentic to who you are. That helps in the cultural sensitivity, but I also think um, you you don't putting someone in an Indian sari, which they do when I go. They send someone to my room to dress me because I could never get all that stuff on myself. But it does not make you um, if you are authentic to who you are. I think that's very important common sense rule. Don't try to be who you're not. Don't teach what you don't know. Don't try to give something you haven't lived like you've lived it and that you've been perfect at living it. You have to be authentic. This is hard. This isn't easy. It's a
Mhm.
way of life. It becomes more dynamic every day that you live it. It might not get easier every day, but it becomes more familiar every day.
Yeah.
I think when you are authentic to your calling and to who you are, it gives you a voice of influence. It also gives an understanding that that she has made it true to what she can do. So I need to take the understanding and the learning and make it true to how I can serve him. You know, to be comfortable with it. We're called to be authentic to the commission itself, making known the gospel of Jesus Christ, not making known the gospel of Kathy Payne,
Yeah.
not making known the gospel of Alejandra. It's to be known among the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to love, to genuinely understand that Jesus really loved these people.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't just there to make their life better. He was there because he loved them and he wanted to bring them to a place where he was for the rest of his life. I love that the Bible, all the way through, from Genesis all the way through, says, I will be with you. 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 And then comes the day when Jesus says, I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, you can come be with me. That's part of that, understanding how this gospel is relevant to everyone. I remember one of the conferences I went to, I believe that it was in Africa. You said practical aspects. One of those is going, seeing it, hearing it, reading about it, understanding. The White Wing this month, and the month of March, is just full of the, I hesitate to call them stories because people think those are fairy tales. Let me say this, the narratives of the ministries that are ongoing in the nations.
Yeah.
Just incredible ministries that are going on. And I remember going into this conference where there was a young woman. I was praying for her at the very beginning of the conference, and I knew her story. They had told me she had been physically abused by her parents, her biological parents. She had been repeatedly raped and beaten, and to the point where the government had actually removed her, and she was living with a pastor and his wife, and they were teaching her the love of God, And as I held her in my arms and she was just weeping, I knew there was no way for me to communicate words to her. I didn't speak her language. I knew nothing of what she had experienced in her life. But what I could communicate to her, the practicality, was the love of Christ. And that being the dynamic that is most practical, that must be communicated and given and shared in a way that people can understand it. Pray, to ask God to make us aware of where He's leading us. That's extremely practical. Some of the things that I say when people are saying, I'm trying to figure out if I'm called to go to the nations or not. Well, let me just say, first of all, we're all called to go to the nations, whether we go physically or whether we pray or whether we send our funding there. We are all called. Every one of us have this call, go ye into all the world, all the nations, to the very ends of the world. We are called to go into the nations, period. Period. Now, if you are called to physically go, there are some real practical things. I always ask someone when they call, where might I go? What language do you speak? Is there another language that might be an early indicator, like you went to Serbia. You might not have known they spoke Spanish, but the Lord knew, and He got you there. So that's one of the things that, those practicalities. One of the practicalities that doesn't always work, but I'll mention it. When I went to Pakistan, people asked me, can you go get a tan and can you go put contact lenses in your eyes that are brown? Well, that didn't work for me. I wanted the Lord to remember who I was. I wanted Him to be able to recognize me. But some of those do help. Where can you go where you might be immediately accepted just for, then the other practicality is this. You may never be able to go physically, but man, you can go in your prayers.
Yeah.
We have a calendar here that we produce every year in missions, and every month there are the pictures and the appointments of our leaders throughout the world. And you can go, like in January, I think January is the general presbyters, but February, it's Africa. And you can, in February, the month of February, you can pray for every leader by name and by nation. You can actually put them on the map of where they serve and how they serve. And that is a practicality that even hell is afraid of. It shakes the foundations of hell when we pray. There is that practicality of praying. There is the practicality of becoming aware,
Yeah.
reading in the White Wing, reading. You were sharing with me earlier about Shelley has. I imagine you're a one child fund donor. You're involved in the one child fund ministry. So Shelley, who works for One Child Fund and Global Missions, she has made a business card for every one of the children in every one of our orphanages,
Yeah.
and she passes those out, and it tells about the child. It tells what grade the child's in, how old the child is, where they're going to school, how good a student they are, what they want to be when they grow up. So there are so many of our children. I was just a few days ago in the nation of Nepal and got to visit with our orphanage children there. And as we were standing there, I just began to interview them. I didn't plan it. It wasn't something, it just automatically came, and I grabbed somebody who was recording with their phone. I said, stand with me. And I said, who are you and how old are you and what's your favorite subject in school and what do you want to be when you grow up? And what's amazing when you read these little business cards of these children, they want to be doctors. They want to be lawyers. They want to be
Yeah.
pastors. They want to be children's minister leaders. They want to give back to this amazing ministry that has given to them, that has placed them where they can sleep in a bed. They actually have a bed, and it's in a safe place. It's the same bed. They get to be in the same bed every night, and they actually get to eat food that is good for them, and they actually experience the love of a savior and the love of a community that work in this orphanage and care for them and teach them about Jesus. They get to go to school. If they're in a Church of God of Prophecy orphanage, they get to go to school. That's part of our ministry. And those are real substantial practicalities. And then this is one of the ones that is so important to us. Fund them.
Yeah.
Invest in these nations. Invest in the men and women who are giving their life for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Many of them in a nation that is foreign to them. They have made it their home, and they are there, and they are giving full their full lives to this ministry. And of course, invest in them, invest in the ministries, invest in their pastors, invest in youth ministries, invest in their children, do fundraising in March and October, these 2 months. Every year we take missions all year long, every month, second Sunday. But in March and October, we work to provide the budget for the following year. So we raise the funding for the budget for the following year, and those two, and mission giving is the most important aspect of that, because it is support that leader so he can be in, and his family, so he can be in full-time ministry. It's such an important practicality of giving. And of course, I hear people who say, oh, well, I support an orphanage, for this organization or that organization. And I know that's needful, and I know it's important that children are invested in, but I also know that we have children in our fellowship that we're investing. I also hear them, as they talk about, oh, I support that ministry that does this and that. We also support. And of course, I have calls all the time that say, I met this man online. He's got a great, thriving ministry, and we have a great, thriving ministry there. Let's support these. Let's support our family, our brothers and sisters. This is our
Mhm.
global family. So let's give and support. As you've
Yeah.
read about what they're doing, I love this if you don't mind, I'm going to tell one more story. I was working one night. Has been some years ago. I was working late in the office, and I was there about midnight, and phone rang, and I saw that it was from a pastor in California. So even at midnight, it's 9 o'clock there. He's got to know I'm not in the office, but yet here I am. I pick up the phone. I'm talking to him, and Sister Payne, I was going to leave a message for you. What are you doing in the office? I said, I'm working. I'm doing in the office. I'm working. And so it was at the end of, I believe it was March mission drive, and they had received, I think it was the largest offering they had ever given. They had, the Lord had just poured out, and it was wonderful because the nation that they were investing in was at a real critical point in their ministry and enlarging. And he said, I can't remember. It seemed like there was, I think they'd raised about $17,478. It was very specific. And he said, so I wanted to break this down for you. We want to give this much to this project that they're doing. We want to give this much to the bishop because we know it supports his ministry, and we know that needs to go in the pot so he can be sustained, and we want to give this. And they knew their ministry. They knew their nation. It was the nation of Tanzania. And they knew that nation so well that they had been able to specifically raise money. And when he said, we have, I think it was about $7,000 left. And when he said it, I just laughed out loud because it was the exact need that was needed for a church to be roofed. And I had gotten that need in my office 2 or 3 days before he called. And the thing is, when you build churches out there, you use the dirt, you use dung, and if you don't get a roof on before rainy season, they make their blocks. And if you don't get a roof on before rainy season, the church just disappears. All the work is for nothing. And so they were asking. And so the amount of money that he had left was to the penny what they needed to get a roof on the church before rainy season. But I thought, this is the dynamics of what we hope for. This is the practicality of discipleship
Yeah.
in nations, is to be aware of the ministry that they are leading and how it is going forward. Just to be aware.
Yeah. I really think that what you've said, covers that idea of meaningful relationships in this cross-cultural context, right? Because the last part of the story that you're telling is they were aware of the needs within our fellowship.
Exactly. Exactly.
And
And
they,
by the way, they'd never been to that nation,
yeah, yeah,
but they were
yeah.
aware. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a very important thing because I feel like sometimes we want to kind of check that box within our ministry or our churches, and we're like, we are engaged globally, or we want to check that we fundraise and
Yeah.
different things. But we are not necessarily connected
Right.
to our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world who are our brothers and sisters in Christ,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
who also I, I think that an important thing to say is that we don't necessarily have to do that work necessarily of going and figuring out what is happening because
Right.
in your ministry you have a setup where you are able to tell us what those needs are.
Exactly.
And then we do more, we can do our own work of getting to know their culture, their history from where we are, and being able to engage that with our prayer efforts.
Having an awareness. And
So that's very
clearly it
important.
spoke to me that the bishop had been
Hmm.
to their church,
Yeah.
which is another practicality when they're here
Hmm.
for assemblies. Bring them in. Let them
Yeah.
sit and talk to you. One of the things that blesses me, and I promise that I hope that this will be the last story I want to tell, but I want to reflect it. Bulgaria
Mhm.
is their people are transitional. They're constantly moving. It's a people that are don't always stay real connected, and so when um, when a Jewish temple when the people had relocated, they had gone back to Israel and they wanted to sell their building right there in Rusi in Bulgaria. They contacted our church to see if we wanted to purchase it, and we were able to purchase it. It was really exciting to see. It was in a different neighborhood. We had been relegated before to be out in empty warehouses outside of town, and turn those huge cold buildings into churches in the winter. But this was a place right in a community. And as they were transforming that synagogue, they found a lot of things that let them know that that synagogue had been built by Christian construction workers. Like when they took off all the gold for their worship, they found crosses that had been put into the wood of the structure of the church. And so, as they realized that this church had been built by in faith by Christian workers, they began to realize that this was very strategic for them. And one of the first things they did before they ever finished transforming the synagogue into a church, they sent people out into the community, perhaps up to 2 miles. Their leadership, their ministers, took a clipboard and they went door to door in houses and apartment buildings. We're a Christian group. We're transforming this building over here that's been a synagogue. We're about to open it. We're going to be establishing a ministry center there. And we want to introduce ourselves to you, and we want to know how we can pray for you. That was the only question they asked the first time they came. They didn't try to do witnessing, anything. They just said, we want to know our community. We want to know who you are. We want to know what you're dealing with. We want to know how we can pray for you. Well, while they wouldn't listen to anybody else, let me share this little whatever. When genuine interest was expressed in them, how can we help you? How can we bless you? How can we minister to you? Like 90% of the people had a need that they could pray about.
Yeah.
I mean, 90% of the people, some still shut the doors, but 90% of the people, yeah. So 3 weeks later, they sent those same people back to those same homes. And just wanted to check with you and see how things are going. Have you seen any changes? Have there been any, can you testify to me as to you seeing the Lord working? Do we need to keep praying in the vein that we've been praying in? Are there any other things that have come up? And so, again, 3 weeks later, they did the same follow-up. And when they opened the church, it was amazing how much of this community came in. They'd already shown that they were aware that this community had needs. They had made themselves known to them. They had been concerned about what things were concerning them. And already, they had connected this community with this church. I thought, what a wonderful disciple making. And they became part of the ministry and I want to do what I've seen you doing. I want to be. And it was powerful. And that church today is still a testimony of God's faithfulness in this community.
Wow. It is so amazing. So we are coming to the end of this episode, and I want to thank you so much for not only your insight, but also for the testimonies that you have shared, and also directing us in those practical ways to engage the disciple making effort from this global perspective. And I liked very much what you said, that we are all called to the nations. It is not only a few of us, it's not
Yeah.
only, them, is all of us are called to the nations, because that is what Jesus said. That is how the Great Commission starts. And it is our work. And we might not be able to be there physically, but we can support in other ways. We can encourage that dynamic within our churches. And sometimes we also have people from other nations within our cities. So, that important work
Oh,
of
yeah.
just opening ourselves up to God's love and let that guide us.
Yeah.
I do remember, I love what you said about being ourselves, because when I went to Serbia, I had been preparing, learning the language, and I had I knew the Lord was leading me there because of many things that happened prior to going there, and just the way that things were orchestrated through almost, I would say, like 5 years of just praying and asking God, hearing, God leading me in that direction and not knowing how to get there. And I remember God putting a person in my life who just happened to have a connection for me to get there.
Yeah.
And so it was an answered prayer in that sense, but through that person that I was able to connect through, uh, there have been missionaries for many years, and he, um he of that couple, he had gained that language from the nation that he had gone to minister to.
Right.
Like he was
Wow.
able to speak the language of that nation. And so with that testimony, my prayer when I was in Serbia was like, God, if you've done it for him, I think you
Right.
can do it for me too.
Right.
And I
Right.
would pray every day that God would give me the language, that God would allow me to speak to the people in their language, because I understand just how you're able to be yourself, but also they're able to be themselves if they speak in their language.
Right.
And so I was like, I want to connect in that level. So the whole time I was there, I was praying and I was listening, I was throwing myself into opportunities to learn the language. And it's an uncomfortable place. And there's a moment within that dynamic where you start feeling a level of nostalgia and sadness that is gonna pair to your homesickness, but also
Yeah.
not hearing your mother tongue or not hearing the language that you're used to.
Right.
It just causes that type of, you know, nostalgia and homesickness within you,
Loneliness. Yeah.
loneliness.
Loneliness.
And people are having fun and you're going to events and people are having a great time and you don't understand what they're saying. Um, but I kept praying, and then it came the time where I had to minister in one of the camps, and you know, I did notice that people were drawn to me because of being a Spanish speaking and because I was Mexican, and they don't see a lot of Mexicans all the time. So they were just so thrilled to meet me and to get to know me. So a lot of people came to that camp and I shared my story. And one of the things that I prayed about was connect with them, because these are women who at that point they lost children to the war. Um, they had lost their husbands during the 90s conflict. So there were so many dynamics there that were very difficult, and I wanted to be sensitive to that.
Yeah.
And so when I preached, and I shared that night for the women's camp, they came to me afterwards and they're like, you might not, and it's like a lot of people have come, but you were able to speak our language.
Yeah.
And I didn't speak their language for like in a literal way, but
Right.
they were identified by just the work of God through one's suffering. And so that was an amazing thing to learn, that you can be yourself, but also open yourself up to God's love, because that is the thing that links us to people in other cultures
Exactly.
and helps us navigate those cultural dynamics and differences.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for this
Such a
enriching
privilege. Thank you for
conversation.
the invitation.
Yes.
Uh,
And we are so glad that you were able to accompany us and be part of this series of rediscovering discipleship. And
Thank
we
you
are
very
very
much.
thrilled for the rest of the series, and we're really thankful for you.
Thank you, Alejandra.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Global Missions and Discipleship. We hope you gained practical insight that will help you in your ministry. Don't forget to join us on our next podcast episode. If you are interested in more training resources, visit our website at www.nddcogop.org.